Hi everyone, thank you for joining us here in Brighton. I know it's sunny and I know lots of people have been out in the sunshine. Please do, if you're here, spend some more time in the exhibitor hall, in the Humanities Lab, or the City Films screenings, and the Bailsburg projects. Although for Jubilee as well, I know the attraction of lunchtime was going to enjoy the sunshine, which I don't blame you, but please make the most of seeing people's exhibits. In this session today, we are both online and in person, and we are launching the Digital Memory Dialogues, which is one of the work strands that is funded under the Alfred Landecker Foundation grant that we have for the Landecker Digital Memory Lab here at the University of Sussex. Dialogues, I'm going to explain it in a minute, the web address is there, www.digitalmemorydialogues.com. And our first dialogues is around computer games, and our core question we're exploring with our contributors and guest chair this afternoon is, can Holocaust be made playable in computer games? This will be strange for people joining us remotely, but every one of our sessions here at the Expo, I've been given a taste of Sussex culture, or East Sussex culture. You may probably all be very familiar with the British tradition of Guy Fawkes Night. It's only on the 5th of November, but Sussex has bonfire societies and has its own particular history. So alongside marking Guy Fawkes Night throughout the autumn, it also commemorates the burning of 70 Protestant martyrs. Lewis is the biggest one of these kind of commemorations, celebrations. Very, very different. If you ever get a chance to come back in November, it's a peculiar festival, but it really kind of is rooted, it shows you how Sussex is rooted in tradition and history. You can't really go those things. But it's an amazing event. It's this huge historical and spectacular. There is so much fire, as you can see in this image, that the whole town, apart from in this picture, board up their windows. All the transport stops going into the town hours before. And it just, yeah, it's lots of historical parades. And the kind of very controversial thing they do is burn giant, larger-than-life effigies, which is based on the historical triad of the devil, pope, and pretender. They always still, I think, burn an effigy of the current pope, which is where the controversy is. And then they pick two public figures that are particularly disliked. And so we've seen Theresa May, Kim Jong-un, and Donald Trump in these huge things that paraded through the town. So it's a very peculiar festival if you're from outside of East Sussex, but this is the kind of, Sussex likes its traditions, and this is one of them. For those that are here and also online, you can join in. We've been trying to have kind of a hybrid conversation. We had some questions yesterday, and today there's a new set of questions. There's a QR code there. You can also join in the code, and the vote code is at the top there. One of the questions in today's series is, should the Holocaust be a subject matter for computer games? We'd be really interested to hear what you think. We put the yes, no, but the wider Nazi period can be. And this will be part of the discussion that will come out of today. There's also some questions there, other themes and topics around other themes that we've been discussing today here at the Expo. So before we move on to our roundtable, I'm going to launch and talk about dialogues and what it is a little bit. The way the kind of lab came into being really was through, that we had a big plan to do an international partnership project, travel to various countries, bring people from different museums in the US, in I think at the time South Africa, Australia, and across Europe, and share knowledge and work with local communities. It was a beautiful idea. And we submitted the grant around the 17th of March, 2020. No one was going to fund anyone to do that kind of international movement. And the grant was voted brilliantly, but we weren't going to get the funding for it. So instead, I hosted a series of online discussions. Some of our panelists here today were part of those discussions. And Dialogues has kind of riffed off that idea. So how can we continue to have discussions online or in hybrid ways, but particularly what we're trying to do then, and I think we are doing better now, hopefully with this panel, is to talk across disciplines and across sectors. And that's very much been the idea of the Expo, and Dialogues is our kind of constant attempt to have these conversations. And they are dialogical because it is not just a kind of traditional academic journal. It is a publishing space, it is open access, it's online here, and you can see this episode or kind of series We start with a provocation for the first one. I put myself in the deep end to sort of see how it worked rather than ask someone else to do that as the guest editor. We will have a guest editor, so Nicola and Marina will do the next one on AI. So the guest editor, or me in this case, writes the provocation, kind of writes about the state of play in a particular theme or topic that our editorial board are working with us to define, and sets guiding questions for the dialogue. And then we curate 4 responses, trying to pick people from different disciplines and different sectors. And the respondents are asked to engage with at least one of the guiding questions. And as I said, the idea is that this is a cross-sector and interdisciplinary representation. And then the respondents peer review each other's piece. So they're already, before they're writing their final piece, seeing each other's work, and sort of the dialogue begins. Obviously, we want to have nuance, so the guest editor is checking everything at the end, and then the provocation is published in the first week, and then the 4 weeks that follow, the responses come out weekly. And then the important part for us is that this opens up at that point. So every single dialogue will end with a live online discussion. For this launch, we're doing a hybrid event because we're here at the Expo. And the editor, the respondents, and whoever wants to join us in the audience can then kind of further continue that conversation. And at the end of each respondent, the respondents offered up questions for discussion. So this idea that this kind of conversation continues. So I'm now going to pass on to our guest chair, Dr. Nick Webber. Myself and the respondents of this first dialogue around computer games are going to come and sit here for a roundtable discussion. So Nick and fellow respondents and contributors, please join me.
Thank you, Vicky, and hopefully everyone can hear us online okay. So the way we're going to go through this is I'm going to introduce our lovely panelists, and then you're going to hear a bit from all of them, well, a little bit from me and then a little bit from all of them about the contributions and their kind of ideas in this space. And then we'll move on to some questions, so kind of be thinking of your questions. If you've got questions online, make those available to our facilitators, they'll let us know, and we'll bring you into the discussion. So to start with, let me introduce all of our panelists. Vicky, I think you will know as the host of this event and the convener of everything. So next to Vicky, we have Jörg Friedrich. Jörg is co-founder and game director at Paint Bucket Games, developers of historically significant titles including Through the Darkest of Times, The Darkest Files, Remember the Children of Bellingshausen and Forced Abroad. And these are all exploring different facets of Nazi Germany and its aftermath. His studio creates award-winning games that serve as tools for historical memory, and Friedrich also offers workshops and consulting for institutions on developing serious games. Next to Jörg is Dr. Tabea Wiedmann, and Tabea is responsible for digital mediation and format development at the Zeppelin Museum. Previously, as project lead for at the Foundation for Digital Games Culture, she headed pilot projects at the interface of games and memory cultures, as well as foreign policy. Her dissertation, The Game is the Memory, explored games as memory media and forms of mediatized witnessing. Her research and work focuses on digital memory, cultures, and social transformations through digital technologies. Next, we have Russ Sitka. Russ is lead designer and developer of interactive experiments in future projects at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His work incorporates multidisciplinary creative and technology skills to prototype new experiences, research new techniques and technologies, and explore possibilities to enhance how history is felt, understood, and transmitted. Next to Russ, we also have Silvina Fernandez-Duque. Silvina is Future Projects Manager at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. As part of an innovative lab team, she explores the potential of emerging technologies in museums, researching and prototyping new experiences for visitors and learners, with a particular focus on difficult history. And last but not least, Dr. Elena Berta is a historian and curator who focuses on the history of the Holocaust, digital history, and gender studies. She's, since its inception, the project director for, is it hashtag Last Scene or just Last Scene? Yeah. Last Scene, and based at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin-Brandenburg, at the Freie Universität Berlin. So, just to kind of start us off and to get us thinking across these dialogues that Vicky's talked about, a few starting observations maybe of some of the common ground that we've got coming out in those discussions, and maybe some of the points where we might want to kind of talk a little bit more. So I had a quick conversation with Jörg yesterday, and he observed that you're broadly in agreement on a lot of things, which I think, I think is broadly true, but I think there's some spaces that we can think about a bit more as well. I think key things are coming out here. Controversy regarding the trivialization and Holocaust memory, and the concern about how that connects or plays out in the space of games. Survivor testimony and the importance of that as a kind of gold standard in this space. The idea of Holocaust memory as something which is fundamentally mediated in the way in which we engage and experience it. And then some other sort of ideas that come out about the kinds of games that have been made so far and the kinds of selections that have been, or choices that have been made when making games. So the fact that there are relatively few games, for example, that explicitly follow a Jewish protagonist at the time of the Holocaust or at the time or during the Nazi era, versus other kinds of games which maybe are more distant. It's more commonplace for us to see games which are based in a later period, which are investigative, which are journalistic perhaps. There's a set of questions for us to think about agency. So it tends to seem like the more games engage with victim experiences, the less agency players have. And that's something I think we could talk about quite productively as we go through. And there's a question here as well, I think, connected to that, about how the funding landscape shapes the games that get made as well. Vicky, and she may come to this when she talks a little bit about her own thing, but asked a question about the extent to which the games that we've been making about the Holocaust are just interactive literature. And as somebody who works connected with the space of games, my response to that was, ouch. Because I think it suggests that these aren't games, and that's a concern. And that made me think about the genre of walking simulators, which you may know about or you may not. So walking simulators tend to be games where you're navigating a landscape and learning about things, but there's often a discussion about agency connected with those. And all of that connection with agency is connected to the discussion about whether or not games are able to represent the gravity of the Holocaust, the real significance of this event. And thinking beyond agency, we also have to think about kind of discussions more generally about games and agency, I think, in this discussion. Janet Murray, who's quite a famous writer on kind of digital literature and things like that, Janet Murray defines agency as the satisfying power to take meaningful action. And one of the things that you often get in games is the idea that games are made powerful by constraint or made interesting by constraint. It's much more fun to do something in a tight space where you're constrained and for example, you have to do something quickly, or you have to do something with limited control. But constraint can also be too much. If you strip out agency entirely, you make an experience less meaningful. So this butts up against risk. The risk of reducing actions to yes or no binaries, rather than complex choices based on multiple factors, but the risk equally of giving people leeway to play with something perhaps you don't want them to play with. Beyond that, I think there's some thinking about distance, about critical distance and distance from the event. There is some thinking about what games can do that other media can't, but equally what ethically appropriate representations remain within the limits of being a game. The difference between engagements with passive and active media, so thinking about the difference between games and film, effectively. And then some final kind of ideas, really, about who games are for versus who is assessing whether games are suitable for that process. Who gets to decide? Is it the right people? The key idea which comes out in one of the contributions of discomfort, which I think is a kind of great way to get into some of these discussions. A long-standing question which comes up a lot in historical games discussions is the tension between ideas of accuracy, historical accuracy, versus ideas of historical authenticity, versus ideas of historical authority. What are these games trying to do? What are we trying to do when we make games like this? And then some final points really about literacy. So thinking about the connection between historical literacy, media literacy, and more general gaming literacy. One of the things that we tend to not teach in schools is we don't teach people to play and read games in the same way we teach them to read literature or to read film. And that creates problems when we want to communicate complex ideas in games. And also the ongoing problem of misinformation and media literacy. But overall, games are there. We have to deal with them. And if we don't deal with them, we cede the ground to somebody else who will, and maybe they won't do that in the sensitive and complicated way we want them to. And one of the things we also know about games, about media in general, is the representation that's created in the media spaces where people encounter information sets their expectation for further experiences of representation. So if games don't represent things the way we want them to be represented, that will fundamentally shape people's understanding of games in a different direction. So I think talking about all of those issues is going to be kind of at the heart of this discussion about games. And I'm going to hand over to Vicky to talk a bit about her contribution.
We're not going to just repeat what we wrote, because you can read that online, and there's nothing worse than someone reading out their chapter or something. And please do engage in it. I think the contributions were fascinating to read, but we're just going to go summarize our positions as such and try. I've asked all speakers if they can sort of speak to some of the connections and the points of contention between our pieces of writing. So the question, my provocation as such, was this kind of idea of like, have we really explored the potential of the medium for Holocaust memory yet? And I know Jorg touches on this and his experience of this, but when I first wrote the book proposal for the book that I will one day write, this is how long ago it was before I went on maternity leave, and the last chapter was called Where Are the Holocaust Games? ? And now there are lots of games that are about the Nazi. This was a long time ago now. Yeah, Christian. It was only about 6 years ago that I was kind of writing this proposal, and we are in a completely different landscape now. We have a game arcade here about games based in the Nazi period. You couldn't have done that 6 years ago. It would just been you and Vit. That had these finished, kind of polished games. And it would have still been a core game arcade, but it would have been like a third of the size. And so there was this lot of discussion about Holocaust games being taboo. And kind of the thing I'm pushing at is everyone kind of now seems to want to make a game. And on our map that we've got a project, there's a lot more games coming out. But are they really being games? Are they playing with game mechanics? Are they? Have we kept the word? Are we okay with the word game, so that we can do something else? And I'm thinking here specifically about games that are trying to deal with the Holocaust, with genocide, with mass murder, with violence and oppression at the core of their story. And the three things, and Nick has already touched on this, for me are really these kind of questions about the limits of interactivity, and these come up in particularly in Tobias' piece. The question of whether they're situated in the Holocaust context and the historical moment, or what's come out as a particular genre, particularly in Germany, is the remembrance game. That to engage with the Holocaust through game, you need to come from a contemporary position. Either it's like a survivor reflecting back on their life, or you're in a more contemporary position and you're trying to investigate the past. Or it is situated in the 1930s and 40s, but the realities of violence, oppression, and genocide are really at the boundaries of the game, or the Jewish experience is sidelined. I think some of obviously the survivor stories centralize those people's identity, and the light and the darkness is one of the first things to put the Jewish individual at the center of the story. And there's not to say that the other game shouldn't exist, but that's the kind of mapping of the landscape that we're seeing. And as such, my provocation very much recognises Jorg's earlier struggles in that changing landscape. And I also really appreciate the Usham's future projects team's efforts to be explorative with game forms and carry out user testing. And we talked about this, and Russ presented on one of your projects this morning. The existence of your division and this freedom you have to really explore and test boundaries, but without that necessity that kind of external funding says, well, you have to release the game now, which brings up a lot more barriers. And you've talked before about kind of institutional reputation and things as well, but you can play because no one needs to see it. And you can test those boundaries. And I think it's really, really important that we have the ability to test where are our limits, and what Alina refers to in her piece as discomfort. And yeah, what I think I would really like to see in the discussion today is thinking about whether we can really perceive of making a game about the Holocaust. And I feel everyone's pieces, in some way, we're talking about trepidation, either trepidation to release or discomfort, or as Tabea talks about post-agency, we have remembrance games. And I know your experience with the swastika in games and the tensions around that. And I'm stuck struck particularly by your call to ensure player engagement involves meaningful choices, and if games could just replicate post-Holocaust educational perspectives, how meaningful the choices players are asked to make. Could games offer new possibilities not yet considered for Holocaust memory and education, and what would a productive future for the development of the Holocaust as a subject matter for mainstream gaming be, and what would be needed to, what would we need to do to get there? Or is the question, maybe games just are not the right place to do Holocaust memory and education? And yeah, are we bold enough and brave enough to go, you know what, we tried this, and maybe it is. So I'm going to leave it there with my being provocative.
Thank you, Vicky. Next up, Jörg. Can you pass the mic along, because we've only got a few.
Yeah.
About your position as we go into this discussion.
Okay. Yeah. So I have been making games in this specific field since 9 years now. 2016 was when we decided that we wanted to make a game about the Nazi era, and the decision was pretty much driven by what you just described. We looked around in the world of games and said, okay, if someone now at that date would learn everything they know about the Nazi era from games, they would think Nazis are the people with the cool tanks and the best uniforms, and they have really cool units in World War II games, and they're good enemies to shoot at in many shooters, and that's pretty much it. There were barely games about fascism, about anti-Semitism, about like the political changes that came long before World War II. And that was something that we wanted to change, and we started, and back then the landscape was different and the challenges were different. We saw a lot of backlash from institutions where we had hoped for support, being the unions and also certain areas like the Ministry of Family Affairs, who were worried about our little game and what we were making there, and about the change of us using swastikas in games and pushing for them being allowed to. And yeah, I don't go into much into detail, fast forward, that all of that has changed a lot today. Today we made our second game with a budget 5 times higher than the first one. It was the first game that cost more than $1 million to make. We were working on this for more than 3 years with 15 people. And it's a game about Fritz Bauer and the Auschwitz trials. It's a detective game. It takes place before the Auschwitz trials, and the Auschwitz trials, and again, in general, the Holocaust in Auschwitz is like the dark secret that is as a layer on top of everything else, and it is more telling the story that leads toward it. However, the approach was, because we are game developers, we are not historians, and we are also not educators, we're not making games for education. Our approach was to make a game that people just pick up because they think, oh, this game looks cool, and it's a detective game, and it's somewhat historical, I want to play this. And while they're playing it, they experience the story of Fritz Bauer, of the Auschwitz trials, and then they should leave the game curious. What our game will not do is it will not entirely educate them. It will not give them all the information they need. It will leave them there a little bit, and with some question marks maybe, but will hopefully leave them curious enough to dig deeper. And that's one kind of game, and I think these kind of games, well, obviously, I think they should exist, and they should be, and I think we should explore them further, because otherwise we leave the story of the Holocaust when it comes to pop culture in games either completely blank or to the wrong people. And at the same time, I also appreciate like real deep educational games and projects like you folks are doing, right? And I think that we need both, right? Because lots of what we are doing is kind of we don't get explicit in our game when it comes to the Holocaust. It's a lot of it is basically hinted at, and you find like documents, and And in the end, we explain once, but that's basically already outside of the game, like what the Auschwitz trials were and what led to them. But a lot of it relies on some kind of autocomplete in the player's brain. And by basically, we give hints and we trigger stuff and we push them in a direction. And we hope that the full picture comes in their head, but they need to have these pictures from somewhere else. And that is where museums and history lessons and like true serious games come in my opinion. So when it comes to your provocation, I think a lot has changed. I think we are way further than we were 6 or 8 or 9 years ago. We are not there yet. I think there's more to explore, and I'm happy to do so.
Thank you very much, Jörg. Taber.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for having me. What really struck me when Vicky sent a provocation, so it's quite nice that in my answer I could bring together perspective from my different, maybe not so linear career path. So it was resonated with my research. It resonated when I worked for the Foundation for Digital Games Culture, where we worked with people working at memorial sites and that want to get into computer games and whether they are suitable media for them also to introduce in their educational work. And now I work at a museum, so there somehow I found points of connection with your provocation or your dialogue basically and your answer. So it was really nice for me, all these three aspects somehow came together, and what struck me most was Vicky's question about how can we understand the possibilities of interactivity in game context, because first I think it's the most obvious quality of games that comes to mind, what sets them aside from different media. But the longer I thought about it, I thought maybe there are different angles or there are still moments I think that we might have to explore deeper. And just setting off my argument here, I would like to point out three aspects. So the first one was, and that also is quite obvious, it's interactivity, it points to activity. But while that is quite obvious, I think in memory cultures, we tend to maybe forget that, or for me, what memory cultures are is that we are a collective of trying to remember. So I said it before, but for me, this ing in English is really something that strikes me. So for me, we are actually cultures of remembering. So we're always negotiating what actually is the right way, the appropriate way to remember. And I think interactivity, or moments of interactivity, they stress that. And I think that's an important point to push forward in the discussions that we're having here. Secondly, closely connected to interactivity for me is agency. You also introduced that. And I think games make us aware of our own agency because we have to invest ourselves. But they also, and I think that might be even the more important aspect, they make us aware of the limits of our agency. Or I would wish for conversations to also focus maybe more on those limits, and that's why I try to introduce or just pushed out there this idea of post-agency, just to really stress that on the one hand we're in a post position, so whenever we talk about the past, it is from a temporal distance. But it's not only from a temporal distance, but of course all these memory medias that we have been using now for years and decades, they are mediated. So those are technologies that might create a feeling of proximity, but there's also then, of course, a technical agency at play that also plays a part in it. And of course, it's, I think, rapturous, it's vulnerable processes that we talk about, and also the places and spaces where they happen. So that's something that I think interactivity can help us become aware of or take a closer look at. And lastly, I think it's really important to then, if we look at interactivity in computer games, also then to look beyond the object. And what resonated a lot with me was when we did, for example, these on-sites, like when we worked together with people working at memorial sites, and we let them play the games, and then the question was, what then? And then you had many individuals playing their own game, while memory cultures are, I think, negotiations, our dialogue are something that we share. So we have commemorative practices for collectives, and now we have games that have an individualistic setting somehow. And so the questions that I ask myself is how can we maybe bring these two structures together more constructively? And quite recently, and I'm closing with that, we had an exhibition about games. It was called Choose Your Player at our museum. And it was so interesting because we had some stations where it was not clearly marked, is it a game, what else could it be? And so the questions that arose around the game stations changed the way the visitors perceived the museum space. And they raised questions about the sites of education. So I think it's fruitful because this interconnection asks us, demands of us to think what are games, what are memory games, what might be Holocaust games, but they also ask us what are our sites of memory and what kind of practices do we offer there. So those are the questions that I have with me today, like how can we synergize, how maybe can we introduce moments of fruitful irritation where we see the rupture, maybe between technical agency and our memory cultural agency, and how can we use that to proceed?
Thank you very much. And that point about agency beyond makes me think about kind of Esther Wright's work around the way in which history gets staged outside games like Red Dead Redemption in the commercial space, in paratext and things like that. So coming now, I presume Silvina and Russ, you're going to talk together as based at the same institution?
I'll say a few words first, and then I'll hand it over to Russ. So I would also like to call out David Clevin, who is the third author on our paper and has been a partner with us in thinking about games for years. He's an educator at the museum and has been at the museum almost since it opened. So he's been a huge part of helping us think through a lot of these things. So as was said, Future Projects is a team that, its mandate is basically to experiment, to ask questions, to learn, to share. And so we try to grapple with big topics and see where we can go with them. So games was one of those things that we decided to look at about 7, 8, 9 years ago. But I just wanted to say a few things to sort of set the context for us. It's actually been fascinating for me to be at this expo and to write papers and to read your papers, because we are an American institution talking about the Holocaust. So our context is very different. We are an educational institution, so our mandate is to teach about the Holocaust. So, I think when we were embarking on games, we were thinking very much about our guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust. And we stay away from simulations as bad pedagogy. So it was a very interesting question for us to think about, which is, what is the scenario that the gameplay is happening in? And then what is the context? So an American student has a very different context from a European student, somebody who is maybe connected more closely through family or through an actual location. So all of that sort of informs our approach and how we were thinking about games. And I probably had a few other points I wanted to say, but we really came at this thinking about big high-level questions, and then our approach is always to prototype, to test things out, to share internally. A lot of the work that we do is really about changing the conversation internally. So of course, you just say Holocaust game and your conversation could go down one path, but if you have a prototype and you have a low-stakes environment, you can change the direction of that conversation. So we did several prototypes built on other sort of experiments, and which we described in detail in the paper. I don't know, Russ, you've worked on a lot of these prototypes, so I'm going to let you jump in here.
Sure. So there is kind of a range of game and game-like experiences that we kind of detailed, and actually I think we kind of discovered what provocation question resonated with us after we had kind of put those all on a page, and we said, these all have something in common. And that thing in common was that we almost always situated the role of the person in a kind of post-Holocaust context. And I don't know that it was even a conscious decision at first, but it probably made intuitive sense for those earlier projects that just had game-like qualities to them. But for when I started doing projects relating to games, it was very much intentional, because I tried it the other way, and it was super hard, and I couldn't really find a way around it, honestly. So to be able to find a space where there was a little bit more creative flexibility that was really, I think, situated more in where people actually exist as people learning about this history. That just gave me enough handholds to move forward in building some of the projects that we've built. But we also were kind of thinking about, this is one of the questions we kind of wanted to bring was thinking about outcomes. What is a acceptable outcome of a game? We talked about winning and what does exactly that mean? Walking simulators were mentioned earlier. A lot of walking simulators don't end necessarily with you particularly winning, but you did complete it, and completion is a kind of winning, as long as the player doesn't feel like they've been tricked or in some way deceived, that they felt like their journey was meaningful and that they were still doing something even if they didn't have explicit decisions necessarily, like a branching kind of decision structure, that they were still playing a meaningful part in the experience. So that was, I think, something we were really interested in kind of bringing to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And Alina.
Thank you. When Wiki posed the question, the one thing that came to my mind immediately was, again. We're talking about this again. And then the second question went, why are we talking about that again? Because I think that is the important question behind. Why are we returning to the question, can we do this? And of course, the answer is complex, as the issues we are dealing with are complex. But I try to single out 3 points or 3 factors in this network of complexities. And the first one that we did not really talk about, as we are all, as Eva called us yesterday evening, so kindly but correctly, geeks in what we are doing, is we sometimes tend to overlook the digital transformation that has been going on. We are witnessing and experiencing every day a massive technological and media revolution. Nothing like this has ever happened. And those of us who looked at the web pages of the Wayback Machine produced yesterday immediately saw, 20 years ago, we looked at different stuff and things work differently. 20 years, I'm a historian, is nothing normally. So those last, let's say, 35 years, 40 years of the digital turn, of the digital transformation have been extremely fast-paced. And all of us do not completely understand what's happening. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that I evoked the term of discomfort, not in a Freudian meaning, but here in a more day-to-day meaning. I'm not utterly comfortable with the media I'm dealing with, and I'm not at all comfortable with the power structures behind each algorithm and behind each code that we're using. So that was one of the layers of discomfort I identified. The second one is what we already talked about, and Russ put it just so brilliantly. Gaming has a lot to do with winning. Or is completion already an answer to what we want to achieve? And the third one has, of course, to do with our understanding of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, as a kind of sacred moment. And we do understand, I think in a quite patronizing way, actually, that we should think about ourselves as, in a way, as guardians of memory, but also as gatekeepers. And we need to think about the role that we are self-assigning ourselves here. So I did what I always do. I go back to literature, and I had a look at one of the texts that's always inspiring to me when I think about the digital and Holocaust studies, and that is Saul Friedlander asking about the limits of representation. And I try to figure out where actually are the limits of representation, and where does the discomfort starts. And I take you, when you read through the piece, through a couple of scenarios, through a couple of games that have not been developed, and we really have to ask ourselves, do we want them or don't we want them? But if our answer is we do not want them, we should really start to consider if gaming is the answer to the question we are posing. So one of the games I envisioned in this text is something like a game about the Wilna ghetto resistance, where you have a range of characters to play. You have a young Jewish woman part of the resistance, and part of her task is to smuggle information, smuggle weapons, getting points for that, and potentially shooting Gestapo or SS people. Doesn't feel too bad on a level of discomfort. The other person to play would be Jakob Gens, head of the Judenrat. And then the question is, what can you play here? And you could, of course, play the following situation, the dilemma he went through every day, complying with orders, trying to save people for another month, or not complying with Gestapo orders, or trying to hand over resistance fighters to the Gestapo to potentially have another few people living another month. So what I tried to figure out in this was, whose characters do we want to play? What do we feel comfortable with? And do we feel comfortable as historians, educators, game designers, let's say as self-assigned guardians of Holocaust memory, to let people play ambivalent characters? Because the one thing we often do, especially as we do not do really Holocaust games, but Holocaust adjacent games, is that we fall into a certain trap, and that is the trap of the perpetrator's narrative of the Holocaust. It comes out as a very clean and smooth killing process. It's never been. And there's a lot of ambivalency, and people who've been caught in a trap in this situation and the Holocaust had to make extremely harsh decisions that we are potentially not fully able to understand. But does it make sense to use games to get to this ambivalency, to get to a deeper understanding? So this is what I try to figure out. Where is the discomfort, and where does the discomfort start? And one of my conclusions to give away is I don't have the real answer, which is okay for me. I'm an academic. I can't say I continue working on that. But I come to certain points. We do not use the genre to its full meaning and to its full potential at the moment. We are still going on a very safe level. If we continue that, and if we think we need to continue that, I would really raise the point, is it sensible to do games? Is that really games that we're looking at? Or, and this aligns with what Vicky said in the beginning, is it the genre we are talking about? And I think all of us who had something to do with games in the last few years had some additional word to game. Is it a remembrance game, which is now often a serious game? We are not daring to call it a game, which makes sense when we respect games as a cultural form. But on the other hand, if we are not daring to really do Holocaust games, shouldn't we stop trying it? And my answer, and I get more and more closer to the answer, to say, yes, in that case, it doesn't seem to be the right medium. And why continuing on a path to say, well, it's not working, or why don't we try and do a game that's about Babi Yar, and that is about robbing Jews minutes before they're going to be shot, and tell something about greed. Tell something about the situation and the complexity, or no, the simplicity and the complicity of policemen who are in that role, who are trying to rob people minutes before they shoot them. So what I pose is either go to the extreme or leave the genre.
Thank you. So I'll start us off with some questions building on that, I think, as a way to kind of move back through the group. But if you've got questions as we talk, please put your hand up and we'll bring you in. And similarly online, if you've got questions, drop them into the chat, I think is the mechanism you're using, and then they'll get relayed down to us. So picking up on that point from Alina, and I think coming back through the group, unless you have an answer kind of brewing away, but is the issue here then that do we think as a panel that what we need to be doing is thinking about making these kind of more chaotic, extreme representations in games? Or is it a point that Sylvina and Russ made in their piece, which I thought was interesting, which is the question of, do we think a game about the Holocaust has to depict or replicate the history to teach us effectively about the Holocaust? So I think those two things are worth kind of considering in connection. I don't know if anybody wants to. Do you want to go?
I'm not going to answer you, but I'm particularly interested, actually. I'm going to drop you in this, Nick. Nick and Tabea, you now work at the Zeppelin Museum, which is not this history directly. It's not the Holocaust, but before the Remembrancing Games project. And then obviously, Nick, you work with historical games in a wider context. And I wonder, maybe to start with, if you could talk a little bit about, do you have the same conversations about the ethics of gaming and interactivity when you're talking about games in the Zeppelin Museum? Or is there a kind of freedom to, can you feel the difference between the Holocaust and the Zeppelin Museum and games, and I guess also wider historical games not related to this era?
Thank you very much. So, of course, when we made the exhibition, of course, the Zeppelin is always somewhere in our, even in our changing exhibitions. But what we try to do, because even though we call Zeppelin Museum, we actually also host, like we have a second pillar, we have an art collection there too. So whenever we have changing exhibitions, we try to answer questions, or we look at technologies and see how they have changed society and what impact they have. And so there we had discovered games as one of those driving forces, I think those most vibrant fields where things are happening, where people are invested, that shape people's lives. And so different ideas, so the chapters of the exhibition, I think they touched on similar questions that have arisen already here, like what kind of communities do we form in game cultures? What kind of futures do we envision? What makes a game? And so, of course, these limits of interactivity, we also introduced, like, of course, through the Darkest of Times was also there, because, of course, forced labor is a chapter also connected to the Zeppelin and the institution. But I think it's it has another level, or it's another, I think even the term Holocaust game, I would actually like to go back on that and see, are we actually talking about the same thing here? Or maybe we should start that. And of course, as an academic, I would be like, I would like a definition. And of course, it's going to be an ambiguous one. But I think many points that Alina just made resonated with me. And I think the discussions that we have around games at the moment, these are discussions that we've had in memory cultures, I think, with all the media when they entered. And the question that drives me there is, what do we really gain from depicting, because it's always in interpretation from the present, just put onto the past. What do we really gain from giving a smooth narrative about someone? Because I think it's so easy then to make people like, sorry, let me restart that. Yeah, I think it's too easy to offer these narratives. Now I know how it was. Oh, now I know why they collaborated. Because he had a very good reason. He was afraid of his... So these causalities that games offer, but also movies offer, I think it's questionable if they are really helpful when we talk about the past, because I think we're always thrown back onto ourselves, and then we can feel comfortable because now we found out why history happened the way it happened. And I think discomfort actually lies at the core of memory cultures. And I think this is the driving force, and we should always feel uncomfortable with memory media, because then we strive to get close, and then we continue the work. And I think this is actually, so not getting there, not winning, I think might actually be the modus operandi to go.
And as someone in game studies, we're not going to talk about definitions of games because we'll be here all day. Alina, you had something you wanted to bring in.
I agree with you that discomfort can be a driving force, but I think discomfort and discomfort are not totally the same here to get to the definitions. But nonetheless, I think to use discomfort and to use a second term that I think is helpful is it's work. It's the doing of memory that we are thinking of. And work tends to be quite hard. And it's not always an easy process. And there are obstacles to overcome. So yeah, it fits with the idea of discomfort, but nonetheless, the discomfort I've been talking about comes from different idea here. I wanted to take the opportunity to ask Jörg and the colleagues from the USHMM about thinking about the more extreme games that I've proposed, because I know there are political factors in the background. There is funding in the background to consider. And Jörg outlined in his paper, and for me as a Berliner, Franziska Giffey, the person you've been talking to, she's been our mayor for some time. She's currently the senator for economics in the city. So she's a quite known figure continuing in the field. And I think these interactions, of course, tell us something about memory is something we do in a very public and in a very contested space, and games are within this contested space. So I can put myself in a very comfortable academic position and envision something from the safety of my desk. But you are quite more closer to the front lines there, and you've been, you have the freedom of testing. So I would be really interested in your experiences there.
Yeah, thank you. I actually noted this down already before because I hoped it would happen. Okay, yes, if you came to me with these proposals for these games, I would say all of these scenarios are worth to make a game out of them. I would change the design, most likely, and make it slightly different. But in general, if you came to me and say, like, I want to make a game about Jen, for example, because it's an important story to tell, it's about this ambiguity, it's about would we always all act ethically, and what is that even in that situation, right? Is there even a right or wrong that can be that clearly distinguished in these kind of scenarios? And I think games can do that, and games have been doing that. And so far, we have mainly seen this in fictional scenarios. I worked on a game when I still was in like bigger studios. I worked on a game called Spec Ops: The Line that was about war. It was a shooter, but it was also about war crimes, and during the game you committed war crimes, and we forced players to face the consequences of what they did, basically. And that was, yeah, so there was a lot of controversy about that, but it was also appreciated. But it was a fictional scenario, and dedicatedly so. Or we made a game called Beholder 3, in an authoritarian state, a fictional authoritarian state, where you actually were a snitch or a spy, and you try and you were spying on your neighbors and doing lots of unmoral acts during that. And we were experimenting with the game mechanics of, yes, you're getting points for this act, but in order to get the points, you actually have to harm your family in the act and stuff like this, where exactly this, like, okay, you're feeling greedy or you want to make a career because you know from games have a language sometimes, right? People know what to expect if they get experience points, or if they get a currency, they know that they want to do that. But then suddenly, if you can play with this literally and then lead them on a path that is interesting. We haven't done this with topics around the Holocaust yet, because yes, as you say, we would need to find, first of all, we would need to feel comfortable with the design that we apply. However, I'm also at the point, I really agree with you. I think that would be one of the next steps, is that we look at the ambivalency that we have in other games and see what we can do with that in historical scenarios around that, because I think we're missing out right now. But yeah, we would need to find a setup where I don't know, where I don't have to shut down the studio afterwards and leave the country because everybody hates us. So you do it.
All right. So I kind of want to build on that before giving our kind of response. But one thing that I think is really tricky when you're talking about different kinds of concepts for games is the best way to describe a game is sort of the end experience, but there's the whole matter of pacing and gradual reveals. And I mean, to give an example that I think some of us might be familiar with, Papers, Please, which doesn't necessarily have the most shocking world-upending reveal, but throughout the game, like, the nature of what you're doing changes. You don't immediately say, you know, I am aiding this evil government and letting my family starve. It's kind of very gradually these things are added. At first, you're just like, I'm stamping these passports and I'm, you know, navigating the interface, and there's like a few different characters I'm encountering, and it really eases you into something that becomes a lot more uncomfortable. And so part of me wonders if part of what feels so scary about this is we talk about the most extreme part of this total experience, which evolves over the course of experiencing it, at least in some cases. And I guess to speak a little bit, and I'll pass to Silvina to maybe give some more follow-up if she wants, but I think for us, we find that some of the, I mean, a lot of those concepts are stepping into the historical period that is kind of for how our museum portrays most of its content, both in our permanent exhibition and on our website. The permanent exhibition particularly was designed to be very documentary-like, very much the facts as it is, very much trying to not create an enhancement of drama, letting things kind of speak for themselves, and the intensity of scenarios like those hypothetical ones given, I think, might edge into territory that we would be pretty uncomfortable with, just in terms of how our philosophy towards how we share the history, how we teach it to the public. Silvina, do you have anything?
I'm gonna say something that might get me fired. One thing I've learned in the work that we do and in our process is you can't really think your way out of a question. I think sometimes you just have to do it and see what happens. And I'm also super impressed a lot of the times with what happens when you get a team of people together, and the kind of collaboration and the kind of thinking that happens when you can bounce ideas off of each other. And so sometimes you just have to just dive in and see what happens. And I think what a lot of our approach has been to create as low stakes of an environment as you can. So I love that you raised this question, because yes, I don't think we would. We just had a conversation recently amongst our colleagues of graphic imagery, and how much graphic imagery do you put on display for the public? Because you want to share the truth, but at the same time, like, what are you actually conveying with, you know, extreme? So what are you conveying with sort of this extreme story? And I think there's a place where you can have a conversation to say, well, what are we actually trying to say with this very extreme story? And you mentioned greed. So how can you show greed, perhaps, without being literally graphic? So these are just sort of some of the things that are coming up for me, which, you know, on the one hand, you know, the sort of the educator side of me says, this is, you know, this could go off the rails very quickly, but the creative side of me is thinking, well, we don't know what is possible unless we actually try. So I have no idea how we would go about doing something like that at the museum, but on an abstract level, I want to say, I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, I guess is my point.
Thank you all, and as you can see, we could talk to each other all day, so I hope you've got some questions coming through to direct our discussion. I'll just respond quickly to your question kind of at the start of that, Vicky. So some of the ways in which other historical games have dealt with difficult circumstances has been to make them generic. So we talked about Papers, Please, which obviously does that. It kind of claims to be a sort of generic authoritarian state in some way. Other games that have done similar things, This War of Mine, which you may be familiar with, which is actually on the Polish history curriculum because of its representation of a kind of 1990s conflict in Eastern Europe. And actually what that does is it centers the civilian, so it's very much about the civilian experience of living through conflict, trying to survive, trying to make sure you can feed yourself, etc., etc. So that's one way that things have been done. The other thing that comes to mind, actually, and I'm going to bring us on to agency next, I think, is the ways in which some games have dealt with the matter of agency and showing you agency that you can't have, rather than... There's a thing in video games about doors. There are lots of doors in video games. You can't go through most of them. And so people often ask why those doors are there at all. But obviously it's about representing environments. But there's a game called Depression Quest, which you may have come across, I don't know. And what Depression Quest does is Depression Quest presents you with options, but you can't select them unless your mental health is in the right place to allow you to do so. So it constantly presents you with the thing that you might want to do in a situation, but you don't have the choice to do it. So it will give you, say, 5 options. The first 2 have lines through them. You can't choose those, but they might be the things that you want to do. Do you want to go to the party? I'd love to go to the party. You can't do that. You can only stay in your house because you don't feel in a place to go to a party. So that's an interesting way in which agency gets dealt with. So I'm gonna bring us on to an agency question now, and I'm going to pick up a question that Tabe asked at the end of her piece. How can we create games about Holocaust history, especially those involving choice and strategy? Sorry, I'm reading the wrong question because I'm an idiot. I'll start that again. How can we create productive connections between games and educational spaces that invite reflections on how our agency is manifested in our engagement with Holocaust memory, or rather, our post-agency, as you've christened it?
So now I have to answer my own question.
You don't have to answer your own question. I mean, you're very welcome to if you have a ready answer.
Well, I do have an idea, especially since you brought up This War of Mine, because what I think is most interesting about that game, and that goes back to what I try to introduce as fruitful irritation, because in This War of Mine, you have this group of civilians, and you constantly have to put them before dilemmata. So in order to survive, do you maybe rob an elderly couple nearby and take their medicine and take their food? But your characters will give you feedback according to your choices. And if you force them to go multiple times against their moral compass, they will stop working. They will stop responding to you. And I think here, this is a brilliant moment because as players, I think we are very used to having agency and being able to enact on it and get immediate feedback if it was successful or not. And suddenly here, the game changes. It ruptures its own promise of this is the experience that you're going to have because I'm a digital game and you press a button and things are going to happen there. But suddenly you're thrown out of it somehow. And I think this is a really important, and it can be a powerful reflexive moment of what am I doing, and who am I coordinating at this moment, or what is actually my power relation towards the system that I'm using or not. And I think these are actually questions, and for these kind of questions, so that refer to us as people trying to grasp this history and that are struggling, I think here games can be really powerful petri dishes, so to speak, because they break down reality a bit. So they introduce a couple of rules and they make it somehow a bit more tangible and maybe easier to navigate. And I think here trying to find the right pace towards history, like what can I do to approach it? What would be a good way? And trying to find here characters or trying to invent here positions that we can actually put our shoes in, because these are the emotions and these are the positions that we are actually trying to fill. I think I would like to see more kind of games that try that. And I think here you can go beyond, you're the grandchild of a survivor and you try to figure out what happened. I think these are great starters like Attentat 1942, etc. I think these are great starting points, but I think you can go further. But what I'm still myself not really clear, and here I would like to hand over to my colleagues, is how, what would be a good way to get maybe this feeling of agency, I matter, my participation matters, even if I'm sometimes not really sure what is the right thing to do, and then suddenly returning to a side, to an educational side, which is quite curated, so where again is someone who's trying to lead me, and where on the other hand I as the visitor am also participating and I'm actually also invited to enact on my agency, and I'm still I haven't found a way, or this is what I'm wondering about, how to bring these ideas of very pragmatic interactivity that the game then offers back to on-site agency and interactivity, then that it is open, where I don't get feedback right away, where I have to rely maybe on my own moral compass, where I'm a lot more into this ambiguous sphere.
Vicky?
Try and put various fragmentary ideas in my head together. Hope it makes sense. One is around the extra diegetic, and someone talked about community earlier, gaming communities, and actually gaming is not a game, it's not a text. And I finally got my beta code for your latest game on Sunday via Discord. Right? I had to go on the Discord channel, and the people were like, hey, you've joined the Discord channel. Like, there's a whole community behind it. And the same on Steam with Attendant 1942 and your games as well. There's the Steam community talking about, how do I unlock this achievement? Gaming is not, and hasn't been for a long time, like a text-based medium. It is about this kind of outside engagement as well. It's this extra diegetic thing. And I think there's a question about the kind of educational, the link between the kind of formal education, say, and then these kind of gaming spaces. Do you make the link explicit? So do you use, say, like the Discord channel or the comments space, community spaces in Steam as a space for having more formal educational stuff? Maybe not, maybe it doesn't work, or like Vit had the encyclopedia in the game that you discover, so that the part of the education is inbuilt in the game. Or should we maybe be okay with them not making the link so formal? And Russ, this morning you talked about the curiosity bridge as an idea, as actually you can have a game that and the same with films, right? I was saying yesterday, like Life is Beautiful sparked me to be really curious about what we can do and how we can push film. And at that time, it was the idea of a comedy about the Holocaust, even though we'd had other ones before, was a huge debate and discussion. And now there were films of every single genre. It feels like we're having these same kind of conversations, and actually that was my curiosity bridge into wanting to really probe this subject more. So maybe it's okay to use games as a curiosity bridge, and maybe doing whatever having the freedom as game designers, but maybe the partnership or the link, the explicit link is in the background. So, rather than making a game for a museum, is that museums and educators and game designers meet together and think about kind of a joined up strategy across them. So like we're picking a particular theme, or maybe it is Baba Yara or whatever. But it's not like this game is sponsored by this museum, but there's like we know these exhibitions are going to be on around the same time the game is released. So there's a curiosity bridge there, without kind of, and you talk about this, like the patronizing or the paternalization that we do in kind of Holocaust education, that maybe it's enough to be like, there seems to be a thing that everyone's talking about in different spaces, and the game has brought me there. And I think spaces like Steam and these kind of, and Discord are great spaces for building community and buzz, but it doesn't, you do become paternal when you start using them for really explicit education as well.
Thank you. I'm just going to say Please, if you have any questions. I don't want us to run out of time and you not to have asked your burning question. Did you have a response to that, Russ, as well? Or were you waiting to talk? Oh, we got a question over there as well. So there's a mic coming, don't worry.
One, two, 1, 2. Okay, that works. All right. Hi. So this might be something which is a known factor in the field. Obviously, I'm not in games myself or games media, so I'm not quite as aware. But just when you're talking about player agency, difficult topics, and communities, is there a sort of unspoken awareness that there is an underside to all that, which is there are some very unpleasant communities in gaming, and there is a risk if you give agency to games, especially in relation to atrocity events, that they will exploit or abuse that privilege of dealing with those topics, and thus when you're developing a game around difficult areas, you are constantly having to be aware that if you take it too far, then you might stray into a very negative area where you end up making like a cult game for the alt-right or something because it facilitates engagement with the Holocaust in a way which is a very negative space.
Thank you, great question.
I think you can't control who engages in any space, right? And particularly in recent years, but there was a long history of this. We see swastikas and neo-Nazi stuff at memorial sites, right? And arson attacks and other kind of attacks, and those are memorial spaces. They're physical. That you have to, and often I'm seeing some of the people nodding whose sites are really quite difficult to get to. You have to make a real effort in physical labor to get to this space, and yet people do that just to make these marks. But then, your first game was so carefully thought through. Like you went here, but there was a trepidation, and you were careful, and there was thought, and yet you got a huge amount of public backlash about using the swastika, and it was not being used here as an offensive symbol, right? It was being used on people's uniforms as a historical fact, as a historical symbol, and in a way, it's historical revisionism to sort of get rid of that. And it's like, oh, they're not really Nazis, and they're sort of this ambiguous historical figures. So, yeah, I don't think you can control basically the discourse around your game. And I think also we see this in memorialization, and there was an example earlier today, I think Travnicki, where there's like a memorial that's corroding, and what do you do with that? But there's also lots of examples of memorials. Again, there was it was a long time ago, the one that falls down into the ground in Germany, and it was at times covered in problematic symbols, but it's part of memory culture, and I think people are really talking about it more explicitly this week, that distortion is part of memory culture, and we need to tackle it, and we need to face it. And so if people do suddenly, your game that was really carefully thought through becomes this cult figure, well, there's something about society there that we need to deal with and confront. And I don't think you can have control over how society deals with your game, but I think you then have to engage in that discourse, and what is then happening, and why is that happening?
It's short. I just wanted to say yes. Yes, we're aware, and it's really interesting because even in our games that are abstract, like the Beholder game I talked about earlier, where you play someone spying on neighbors and family in an authoritarian state, there are some people that role play this and enjoy it as being someone in an authoritarian state, and that's something you cannot control. We try to design the narrative and everything that it's not going to be very enjoyable doing that, or it's kind of end up not well, yet it's something you cannot control. And I think to a certain part that's something we need to deal with, same as memorial sites and museums as well, right? That people might use their exhibitions or their material in a way that it was not intended to be used.
Just maybe to continue that thought, and also to draw a comparison to other materials regarding the Holocaust. When materials started to become digitally available, there was a huge debate of whether this should be possible. And the USC Shoah Foundation very slowly released testimonies into the wild, onto YouTube, and then more and more further. And in the beginning, I was among those saying we can't do that because there might be anti-Semitic or Shoah denying comments beneath these testimonies. But I've changed my stance on that over the years, and I'd say, shall we block 99% of people who actively engage with the material because of 1% idiots? It doesn't make sense when you put it into numbers like that. But of course, I think it's something that we encounter, and that has something to do with our understanding of the Holocaust. I wanted to reply to some notions in what we've been listening to in the last answers, and this is coming back to you, Tabea, also about agency and about playing it at the end in a safe mode, I'd say. So we are tackling issues that are somewhere around the field of the Holocaust, but we are not doing it through the lenses and the story of the Holocaust, or the complex bundle of stories of the Holocaust. And the question I want to ask is, why don't we do it? Because I take one step back and say, 80 years after liberation, we are at a point to recognize that right-wing extremism is on one of the highest levels we've ever encountered. All of us ask ourselves, is Holocaust education failing? Have we been doing all that too much in a safe mode? And is our idea to not do things in an extreme way, and in this way of safety mode, not actually one of the problems, is the way we've been talking about the Holocaust, in the way we've been trying to safeguard memory, in the way we've tried to set up the rules of the discourse. One of the issues that's coming back now to us, because that discourse is not going as deep as it should. It is around the issues as we are trying to put things more simple that are complex. And this is what I keep wondering on when I come back to saying, oh yeah, we could get to this notion of, Lawrence Langer calls it a world of choiceless choices that people encountered during the Holocaust, and this non-agency in a kind of set up authoritarian but neutral system in a game. Why do we do that? And this is really a question. This is not my answer. I don't have that answer. But my question is, why do we set up our responses, our topics, in settings that are not the real setting we want to talk about?
I think I was just really wondering, and I think I would know, like in my point of view, there is nothing to gain from these positions, because I think all narratives that derive from those positions are highly problematic. For example, playing the position of a victim that dies, that perpetuates victimhood, something that memory culture doesn't want to, and that we're not striving to do, but it's always, again, looking at people beyond them being victims. Having a victim survive is, I think, an idea of catharsism that does not represent the historical facts that surviving was not what happened regularly. Having a perpetrator that is evil, and you play that position, you will always be like, that's just an evil person, I'm not an evil person, I wouldn't have been a perpetrator. If it's a perpetrator who has reasons, moral dilemmata, and he decides to go one way or another, he just complies. Okay, he was just afraid he would lose his job, he was afraid of the personal risks. This is how you become a perpetrator. So all these narratives I find highly problematic, and I don't think you gain anything from it, but I don't think it's an issue that is purely, again, ascribed to games. I think it's something that we all have to wonder about, the majority of our memory media and the histories and narratives that we have told about the past. I think with games, these questions just become maybe more relevant or come more to the forefront because of our investment and the way that each individual gameplay has an individual experience, and therefore maybe appears closer to us, and therefore, yeah, and maybe that's why it has been so much connected to why we talk about it in context of games. Whereas I think, so, and these are questions of appropriation in my point of view that don't help us and that don't put us forward. But what we are wondering about is what is happening, why is extremism coming back? What are people doing now? And what can I do now in relation to knowledge about the history, in relation to the last witnesses, in relation to other traumatic histories, which I might also perpetuate. So I really like Michael Rothberg's term of the implicated subject. So where do I continue implications that I'm not courageous enough maybe to acknowledge? What do I do about those? And I think these are the questions that are relevant at the moment. It's not about historic narratives. I think it's about nowadays narratives. So in my point of view, here games or here these ideas of agency and interactivity play the more important role. So for me, this is actually not the safer position, choosing a post position. In my point of view, it's just that the more relevant questions derive from these positions.
I would disagree with that in a very simple notion, because we allow other genres to touch upon these subjects in a very deep and meaningful way. We would not consider a film made about the Auschwitz Sonderkommando to be problematic in itself. We discuss it in a critical way, but we embrace it as part of remembrance or memory culture. Why do we do that differently with games? And then we come back to what a game is. I think you're young already, but I don't want to monopolize that.
But that's a relatively new development, isn't it? This in movies. And no, like in my perception as well, movies about perpetrators are a relatively new phenomenon. No?
I would go back to the 40s.
Okay. And well, anyway, what I wanted to say, I think, is I don't know yet. We need to. I think we can, and we should explore it, and we might find something that is useful. I think the most important question is not so much why are we not doing it. The question is why would we do it? What do we think? What do we hope to find there, and then try it out. I think it might. I think there might be an appropriate way, and there might be a responsible way to do that, and to find something new and helpful, but it hasn't been done yet. And with games, they don't work theoretically. You need to play them. That's something I keep telling my students every time. It's like, stop discussing your game ideas. They will not lead you anywhere. Make a game. Start building it, and then try it out, and then see where it leads you and whether it works or not. I think, yeah, it's worth exploring that space. I would also disagree with you there. I think I'm not entirely sure. You might be right, and it might be, yeah, that there's nothing there and it really doesn't work. But maybe there is something to find, and maybe something that can be really useful for education on these topics. Because, yeah, as you said, it works in other. Why do we use other scenarios and feel okay there, and it works, and but we don't? Yeah.
Does it work? I mean, that's now I think the failing of memory culture, or idea of is memory culture failing. I don't think that it only started with games. So the question is, I think I would put all memory media to debate.
I hate to say, we've just got to the juiciest part of a conversation, and it is we've run out of time. But I just want to say two things, because I've got the microphone and I'm closing the session. One, I just want to draw attention to the session we had yesterday with Hamid Hamatash, a workshop on trying to design serious and create serious games in like 3 hours, which was really ambitious. And our group focused on bystander narratives. And I actually think all the the discourse in the last kind of 15 years or so on media witnessing and this distance, and actually this sort of, are we now bystanders when we watch violence and crimes and war, etc., on the news and we do nothing? Is that different from being in a position and doing nothing or making choices? And we always go back to this idea of choiceless choices and the kind of not wanting to do the perpetrator narrative where someone might be, oh, and you're the following orders, and kind of that you could excuse the perpetrator or somehow understand the perpetrator's choices. But actually the majority of people during every conflict, during every genocide, are not victims or perpetrators. They are the general population, and they are constantly making choices, and they are still trying to live some ordinance of everyday life, and we do, and we have lots of conflicts now, and many of our colleagues here are directly affected by those, and they are trying to get on with their normal lives. They're coming to conferences or joining us online. We actually do. We don't just stop everything in our lives when we have conflict, and we make a choice in every part of our day. We make choices, and some of those choices have deep, huge waves and effects on other people's lives. And I'm thinking here about the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition and all those letters. And they go, oh yeah, maybe I'm busy at work. Maybe I'll get round to that letter of my friend trying to flee Europe tomorrow. Yeah, oh no, we have a wedding to go to today. You have your own ordinary life and you live in your own bubble, and we're all selfish human beings at the root of it. And sometimes we're not, and sometimes we come out of it. But actually, I think there is scope for thinking about that kind of role in the historical context. What I wanted to say, just to wrap up, is there's kind of a hint here of action, and this has been discussed in other spaces throughout the expo, and that's kind of what we wanted to get out of the expo. People are here saying, let's try a thing. If anyone else in the audience here online or in person wants to try the thing, let's get together and try it. Okay, let's try and get some funding. Let's put in a bid for bringing game companies, to bring in academics, to bring in museums, to bring in foundations, and other game designers, and come together and try these things together. And that will be my closing words on that. Let's turn some conversation into action. We are 3 minutes over. I think that's the first time we've been over in a session I've been in. But please carry on the discussions and debates over the break. We'll have a half-an-hour break. And then there will be in here a roundtable around the future of Holocaust memory and social media. Thank you so much, Nick, for coming in and chairing, and thank you to everyone for being patient and working through this idea of this dialogues publication with me and being the guinea pigs for our first go. So thank you all very much.